Before marble and gold, before the name of Rome was a thunder that shook the known world, there was only fog and legend over the Tiber. 7 hills wrapped in the silence of shepherds. The myth, tenacious as moss on stone, speaks to us of 2 brothers suckled by a she-wolf, a foundational tale as violent and fraternal as the city that would arise from that primordial mud. But history, less poetic and more anchored to the earth, reveals a village of huts, a crossroads inhabited by a stern people, forged in the discipline of the fields and the constant threat of their neighbours. They were the Latins, a people among many, the Etruscans to the north, with their sombre rites and exquisite art, the Samnites in the mountains, tough as the rock they inhabited. For centuries, Rome was nothing more than a city-state among many, learning to fight out of sheer necessity for survival. They expelled their kings, and the word rex, king, became a poison on the tongue, a reminder of tyranny that would obsess them for generations. They founded a republic, a public thing, an idea as fragile as it was bold, grounded in the duty of the citizen, the authority of the Senate, and obedience to the law. The iron of the sword and the iron of the plough were wielded by the same calloused hands. The legionary returned from the campaign to harvest his wheat, his loyalty forged not to a man, but to the very land that bore him, to the bones of his ancestors. The first great echo of their destiny resonated in the Italian peninsula. War after war, with a tenacity bordering on obsession, they subdued their neighbours. They did not always win. The Gauls sacked the city and left it in ashes, an indelible wound in their collective memory. But from each defeat, Rome rose more sombre, more organised, more relentless. They learned to build roads that led their legions faster, to adapt their tactics, to absorb conquered peoples, not only as subjects, but as future citizens, weaving a network of alliances that turned Italy into their fortress. And then, their eyes turned towards the sea. To the south, beyond the Strait of Messina, rose a power that was their antithesis, Carthage, a city of ivory and purple, born of trade, whose power did not reside in the land, but in the tides that their ships sailed. The clash was not a possibility, it was a destiny. It was a struggle of titans that lasted more than a century, a trial by fire that would decide the soul of the Mediterranean. It was then that history became a man, Hannibal Barca. From the ashes of a century of wars, when the memory of the Ides of March still echoed in the marble halls of the Senate, Rome found itself exhausted. The Republic, that grand idea forged in virtue and law, was now an open wound, a feverish memory fading with each legion marching against another legion. The air smelled of iron and dust, and in the fields, the silence of the dead had replaced the murmur of the harvests. It was an orphaned land, yearning for order, any order that would put an end to the tide of blood. In this twilight of an era, an improbable figure emerged. He was not a colossus like his great-uncle Julius Caesar, nor a tempestuous general like his rival, Mark Antony. He was a young man named Octavian, of fragile appearance, often ill, but possessing a will of ice and an intelligence as sharp as the edge of a gladius. He bore upon his shoulders a name, a lineage, that was both a blessing and a curse. While Antony, in the East, indulged in the luxuries of an ancient world and dreamed of a Hellenistic empire alongside the last queen of Egypt, Octavian, in Rome, wove his power with threads of patience and pragmatism. He understood something fundamental. Rome would not accept a king, but it longed for the authority of one. The confrontation was inevitable, a destiny written in the wind blowing from Egypt to Italy. In the waters of Actium, on the last day of summer in 31 before our era, not only fleets clashed. Two visions of the world collided. On one side, the setting sun of the East, passion and excess personified in Antony and Cleopatra. On the other, the cold and methodical light of the dawn of a new West. The battle was brief, almost anticlimactic. The flight of the Queen and her lover was not merely a military defeat, it was the collapse of a dream. The silence that followed the din of battle was the silence of the world holding its breath, waiting for the new master. When Octavian returned to Rome, he did not do so with the arrogance of a conqueror. He entered with the sobriety of a restorer. He did not tear down the Republic. He emptied it from within, leaving its shell of the ashes of the civil wars had finally cooled, and the clamor of iron against iron had faded into memory. Augustus had left behind not only a lineage but also a silence that spread across the known world like a slow and powerful tide. For nearly 200 years, that silence would take shape and name: the Roman peace. It was not the silence of absence, but the stillness imposed by a will of iron, the calm that follows devastation. It was the peace of Rome. The peasant in Baetica, in the south of Hispania, no longer lifted his gaze to the horizon, fearing the glint of the standards of a legion marching against another. Now, his eyes sought the clouds, the omen of rain for his olive trees. The sound of his life was not the gallop of cavalry, but the buzzing of bees and the creaking of the oil press. In the cities of Gaul, artisans worked clay and metal, and their children learned Latin not as the language of the conqueror, but as the language of trade and law. Peace was something tangible. It was the weight of a reliable coin in the palm of the hand, the certainty that today's road would still be there tomorrow, safe and watched over. This was a peace bought with blood and maintained by the sword. At the borders, in the perpetual mist of the Rhine, or under the relentless sun of Syria, the legions stood eternal guard. The legionary, far from the intrigues of the capital, felt the cold of the steel of his armor on winter mornings. His life was a routine of discipline and waiting, a long vigil at the edges of the civilized world. For him, the emperor was a face on a coin, a name invoked in oaths. But the system that Augustus had woven was stronger than any man. It survived the paranoia of Tiberius in his retreat in Capri, the madness of Caligula, and the extravagances of Nero, while the palace in Rome burned with feverish conspiracies and murder. The oil from Hispania continued to arrive at the port of Ostia. The grain from Egypt continued to feed the populace, and Roman law continued to dispense predictable justice from Britannia to Judea. The Roman peace, that tense calm they called Roman, was not a natural state, but a walled garden. And beyond its walls, in the mist of the Danube and in the sands of the Euphrates, the world did not sleep. Peace was maintained with the unwavering gaze of the legions, with the echo of sandals on the roads, and with the ever-present memory of steel. It was a peace that, to endure, sometimes had to expand its own limits, like a tide reclaiming new shores. The silence of the golden years had been a long and deep inspiration. Now, the empire was preparing to exhale. In this twilight of the 1st century, a man rose who was not born in the heart of Italy, but in its distant confines in sunny Hispania: Marcus Ulpius Trajanus. He was not a patrician raised among the whispers of the Senate. but a soldier who knew the weight of armor on his shoulders and the chill of dawn in a frontier camp. His skin was tanned by the sun of many provinces, and in his eyes was read the geography of the known world. When Rome acclaimed him as the best ruler, it did not acclaim a politician, but the embodiment of its own martial and disciplined soul. Trajan looked at the map, and he did not see borders but seams. The most problematic was Dacia, a kingdom of mountains and forests across the Danube, ruled by a cunning and fierce king, Decebalus. He was not a mere noisy neighbor, he was a constant threat, a dagger aimed at the Balkan belly of the empire. And then, the Danube, that liquid and ancestral border, ceased to be a limit and became a pathway. Over its waters, the engineering of Apollodorus of Damascus laid a bridge of stone and will, and through it marched the legions. It was not an easy conquest. The Roman soldier, accustomed to battle in the open field, faced a people sculpted by mountains and harsh winters. The sound of Roman iron clashing against the fearsome Dacian folks, that curved blade designed to sever limbs and hopes, echoed through the valleys. It was a war of attrition, of sieges on fortified heights, and of blood spilled in the snow. In the end, Roman discipline prevailed over fury. The Dacian capital, Sarmizegetusa, fell in. The clamour of iron has faded from the hills of Dacia, and in the forests of Germania, silence has reclaimed its ancient hold. The tide of expansion, which under Trajan had reached its zenith, begins a slow, almost imperceptible retreat. And in the wake left by the legions, something new begins to grow, as tenacious and persistent as moss on stone. It is not the roar of conquest, but the murmur of administration. It is life in the provinces. Let us imagine a man, a Gaul from the tribe of the Arverni, whose grandfather fought against Caesar. He knows that war only through the veiled tales of the elders told by the fire during the long winter nights. His world is no longer defined by the clan or the wooden palisade of his village, but by the Roman road, a ribbon of grey stone that crosses his fields and seems endless. Along that road travel not only soldiers, but merchants with oil from Hispania and wine from Italy, officials with their wax tablets, and the news of a new emperor whose face, minted on a bronze coin, now rests in his own hand. His life is at once larger and smaller. Larger because he is part of an orb that extends from the mists of Britannia to the sands of Syria. Smaller because his fate is no longer decided by the council of his tribe, but by a governor, a man from Rome, often solitary in his palace, who signs decrees in a language that the Gaul barely understands. This is the true fabric of the empire, the work that survives the clamour of battles. Rome did not govern solely with the sword, but with law, census, and road. In each province, the governor was the miniature emperor. He listened to the disputes of local landowners, oversaw tax collection, the pulse that fed the heart of Rome, and presided over the games in the newly constructed amphitheatre. His task was not to erase the lineage of the subjugated peoples, but to channel it. The old local elites, the ancient chiefs and aristocrats, learned to wear the toga, to speak Latin in the forum, and to finance the construction of a temple or an aqueduct. In exchange for their loyalty, Rome offered them power, citizenship, and a place in the new hierarchy. It was a silent transaction, an unwritten pact over the ashes of lost independence. Thus, the culture of Rome spread not like a wildfire. While life in the provinces was woven with the threads of custom and Roman law, a different pulse, a fever of stone and ambition throbbed at the heart of the world. Rome was no longer a city of brick, as Augustus had found it. It was becoming an idea carved in marble, a testament against oblivion. This is not the tale of a construction, but of a challenge thrown to time itself. To understand Imperial Rome, one must walk its streets not as they are now, ruins kissed by the sun and covered in moss, but as they were then. One must feel the dust of the quarries in the air, hear the rhythmic strike of thousands of hammers against the chisel, the slow groan of carts dragging blocks of travertine along the newly paved roads. It was a symphony of creation, often dissonant, always colossal. They were not mere buildings. They were declarations of power. When Vespasian, a man forged in the discipline of the legions, decided to erect the Flavian amphitheatre, he was not merely raising an arena. Where once lay the private lake of the opulent and hated Golden House of Nero, he returned the land to the people of Rome. The Colosseum rose as a stone echo for the clamour of 80,000 souls, a place where the fate of man and beast was decided under the gaze of Caesar and the gods. Its very existence was a political act, order and public spectacle replacing the whim of a tyrant. One can imagine the weariness on the faces of the engineers, the concern in their calculations as the immense structure grew, ring upon ring, defying gravity with a new and miraculous mixture of lime, sand, and rubble, Roman concrete. But the strength of Rome was not only displayed in the arena. It flowed, silent and constant, through its aqueducts. They were stone arteries that brought the fresh pulse of distant mountains to the very heart of the city. For the common citizen, who no longer depended on the murky waters of the Tiber, the clean water springing from a public fountain was a daily miracle. It changed the smell of the streets, the health of children, the hum of daily life. It was the Pax Romana made liquid, a gift from the emperor that reached every home, every bathhouse, every garden. And then there was contemplation. No work speaks with the silent eloquence of the Pantheon, rebuilt by the travelling emperor, the philosopher Hadrian. As marble and travertine rose in Rome, while the water of the aqueducts sang its triumphant song in the fountains of the eternal city, far, far away, on the misty borders, the true foundation of the empire was being forged. It was not made of stone, but of iron, leather, and an unbreakable will. This was the world of the Roman army. Imagine for a moment the icy fog of winter in Britannia, clinging to Hadrian's wall like a shroud, or the deep and expectant silence of the forests of Germania, a silence that weighed more than any war cry. There, a man, wrapped in his rough wool cloak, felt the cold of the iron of his armour through his tunic. He was not a hero of legend. He was a peasant from Hispania, a young man from Gaul, or a son of Macedonia who had given 25 years of his life in exchange for a promise, citizenship, a pension, a piece of land to die in peace. The legion was not just an army, it was a lineage of discipline. Each man was a cog in a perfect and fearsome machine. His day did not begin with the sun, but with the rough sound of the buccina, the horn that broke the dawn. Marching was their natural state. The weight they carried on their shoulders, the burden, was not just that of their equipment, the chainmail, the helmet, the stakes for the palisade, the digging tools, and their ration of grain, but the weight of Rome itself. In battle, they transformed. They ceased to be individuals and became a tide of red shields. the rectangular shield intertwined with that of his companion, creating a moving wall. Behind him, the gladius, that short and brutal sword, was not a weapon for elegant duels, but a tool for stabbing, to find the gap in the enemy's armor in the claustrophobic chaos of hand-to-hand combat. And before the clash, the air darkened with the flight of the pila, the heavy javelins designed to embed themselves in enemy shields and render them useless, clearing the way for iron. But their work did not end when the enemy fled. The echo of their sandals, the caligae, resonated on the stones of the roads they themselves built, uniting the empire like the seams of a vast tapestry. They dug canals, raised bridges over rivers that, after the clamour of iron and the discipline of the march, the returning legionary to Rome found a different order, a quieter and perpetual war. It was not a battle of swords, but of glances, of gestures, of tunics and of lineages. The society of the empire was a vast pyramid of stone and souls, where every man and woman knew their place, not by written law, but by the invisible weight of tradition and fortune. At the pinnacle, bathed in a cold golden light, resided the senatorial class. They were men whose lineage sank into the very land they owned, vast expanses of fields that conferred upon them a wealth almost geological, slow and immutable. Their power did not reside in the noisy commerce of the forum, but in the whisper, in the influence cultivated over generations. They lived in the cold marble of their villas on the Palatine, surrounded by Greek libraries and the echo of their ancestors, sometimes trapped by the very greatness of their names, bound to a dignity that was both a privilege and a cage. Below them, like a new tide crashing against the old rocks, stirred the equestrian order. They were the practical men, the administrators, the tax collectors, the great merchants. Their wealth was more liquid, flowing in ships laden with grain from Egypt, and in contracts to build an aqueduct in Gaul. They did not have the ancient blood of the senators, but they possessed the ambition and energy that moved the gears of the empire. An equestrian could govern a province or command the Praetorian Guard, touching a power that their grandfathers, perhaps, had not even dreamed of. And then, the immense base, the plebeians, the people of Rome, they were not a uniform mass, but a mosaic of lives. There was the urban plebe, who filled the brick and wood insulae, dark and crowded apartment buildings, whose incessant murmur was the heartbeat of the city. Their lives depended on the delicate machinery of the grain supply, the distribution of grain that kept them fed, and, therefore, at peace. Their loyalty was a currency paid with bread and spectacles, a cynical truth that concealed the daily anxiety of survival. Beyond the walls, the rural plebe worked the fields, often for an absent landowner they would never see, their lives marked by the cycle of sun and rain, by the silence of the land. But even beneath them, there existed an invisible and suffering base upon which everything rested. And so, in the vast expanse of an empire built upon law and iron, beneath a sky that covered Gauls, Syrians, Egyptians, and Hispanics, floated a silent question, as ancient as humanity itself. What sustains all this? The answer, like a whisper rising from 1,000 different altars, was not found solely in the strength of the legions or in the solidity of the roads. It lay in the soul, in the invisible realm of the gods. Roman religion was never a faith of rigid dogmas, but rather a tide that absorbed the beliefs of conquered peoples. It was a practical polytheism, almost contractual. The peasant in Baetica did not pray to Jupiter for the salvation of his soul, but for the rain that would fatten his olive trees. The legionary, in the cold mist of Britannia, whispered a prayer to Mars not for eternal glory, but for the strength of his shield and the certainty of his sword in the imminent battle. In every home, however humble, a small flame burned in honor of the Lares and Penates, the protective spirits of lineage and pantry, a spiritual anchor in the uncertain ocean of life. It was a faith woven with the threads of the everyday: birth, harvest, illness, and death. But an empire of 70 million souls, scattered from the Euphrates to the Atlantic, needed something more than local gods. It required a center of spiritual gravity, a sun around which all lesser stars could orbit. Augustus, with the wisdom of one who has seen the Republic bleed in the ambitions of men, understood that absolute power required an anchor beyond the mortal. It could not simply be a victorious general or a first citizen. It had to be something more. Thus, with masterful subtlety, the imperial cult was born. It was not a violent imposition, but a careful construction, a weaving of politics and piety. After the death of Julius Caesar, the Senate had declared him a god, the Divus Julius. Augustus, his heir, did not commit the blunder of proclaiming herself divine in life, at least not in Rome. There, among the old senators who still remembered the scent of freedom, he presented himself as the restorer of tradition, the Pontifex Maximus, who repaired fallen temples and returned the favor of the gods, the Pax Deorum. But in the provinces, far from the conservative heart of Italy, the seed of divinity found fertile ground. In the east, the echo of the divine Augustus slowly faded, like the heat of a bonfire that consumes itself to ashes. The marble of his forums and temples still gleamed under the sun, but a new chill settled in the hallways of power. The Republic was already a ghost, a story whispered by the elders, and the Empire, that vast and complex machinery, now depended on the pulse of a single man. Thus begins the chronicle of the first blood, the first imperial lineage, the Julio-Claudians. A lineage woven with threads of genius and madness, of duty and poison. The first to receive the purple was Tiberius, a man carved from the stone of the old Republic, a seasoned general and a grim administrator. He did not yearn for power. He accepted it as a burden, with the resignation of a soldier assigned to the last and loneliest of watches. Under his command, the empire functioned with austere efficiency. The borders held firm, the coffers filled. But in Rome, the air grew rarefied. The emperor, distrustful and embittered by family intrigues, retreated to the mists of Capri, ruling through letters and decrees that arrived like cold sentences, while in the city, the dark power of his prefect, Sejanus, grew. Tiberius's silence was the silence of a storm brewing on the horizon, and the common people felt its weight without understanding its origin, like the change in pressure before a tempest. To the darkness succeeded a feverish dawn. Caligula, the young prince, the longing for a new Augustus, soon revealed himself as an uncontrollable flame. At first, there was hope. Treason trials were abolished, games were held, but the light turned to delirium. Absolute power without the restraint of experience or moderation corrupted absolutely. The treasure amassed by Tiberius was squandered on extravagances that defied reason. It is said that he planned to appoint his horse, Incitatus, as consul, not so much out of love for the animal, but as a gesture of supreme contempt towards the Senate and traditions. Fear became the only language of the palace. Each dawn was an unknown, each order a deadly whim. Life in Rome became a grotesque play, directed by an actor who had forgotten the difference between the stage and the world. His end was as violent as his reign. The sound of the steel of the Praetorian Guard in a dark passage of the Palatine put an end to the fever, and from that very violence, the next emperor was born. Behind a curtain, trembling, the lineage of Augustus had extinguished in madness and fire, and with it, the certainty that had borne the weight of the world for a century. The death of Nero left no heir, but a profound silence, a crack that ran through the marble of the Palatine and extended to the farthest borders. In that void, a cold wind of ambition and fear blew. The year 69 of the Common Era was not a year, but 4 successive winters, a season of drawn swords where the empire looked into the mirror and discovered that its face was no longer that of a god, but that of a weary soldier. The first face was that of Galba, an old man carved from the stone of the ancient republic, whose virtue was also his downfall. He marched on Rome with the promise of restoring discipline and order, but his austerity was mistaken for greed. For the Praetorians, the guard that had sold its loyalty to so many Caesars, order was synonymous with gold. The promised donation did not arrive, and loyalty, like water in the desert, evaporated. On the cold ground of the Forum, among the statues of his ancestors, Galba fell. His head, it is said, was paraded on a pike, a macabre trophy announcing that power was no longer inherited. It was taken. He was succeeded by Otho, a figure almost ghostly, an echo of the luxury and intrigue of Nero's court. He bought the throne with the blood of his predecessor, but the power acquired in the city did not guarantee control of the empire. From the mists of the Rhine, the legions had already acclaimed their own man, Vitellius. The news travelled slowly, like a dark tide, and the clash was inevitable. In the fields of northern Italy, at Bedriacum, Roman iron turned against itself, brother against brother, in lands that were meant to nourish the empire, not drink its blood. Otho, witnessing the slaughter and realizing that his cause was lost, chose an end that surprised everyone. That man of dissolute life took his own life with a strange note of dignity, so as not to prolong the civil war. A stoic death in an Epicurean body. Vitellius entered Rome not as a savior, but as a conqueror in his own land. His reign was a brief and heavy nap, a disordered feast while the empire bled. He was a general without a vision of state. The ashes of the year of the 4 emperors still floated in the air of Rome, a fine and bitter dust that settled upon the profane temples and in the memory of men. The roar of the legions marching against themselves had faded, leaving a dense, expectant silence. From this silence emerged a man who did not carry the perfume of the old aristocracy, but the smell of leather, sweat, and earth from distant frontiers. His name was Vespasian. He was not a patrician of divine lineage, but the pragmatic son of a tax collector, a man forged in the dust of the provinces and in the discipline of the camps. His hands, more accustomed to the grip of a sword than to the delicate handling of senatorial intrigue, took the reins of an exhausted and bankrupt empire. The state coffers contained nothing but echoes. Vespasian, with the frugality of a Sabine farmer, began to mend the torn fabric of Rome. He imposed taxes, some as humble as the one that levied a charge for the use of public latrines, and when his son Titus reproached him for the lack of dignity, the old emperor, holding a coin before his nose, uttered the phrase that time has not erased. Pecunia non olet. Money does not smell. It was the voice of a new order, one based on tangible reality, not on the fantasy of an idealized past. And with that money, which smelled of nothing but pragmatism, the Flavians began to build. Over the ruins of Nero's megalomaniac dream, over the lake of his Domus Aurea, Vespasian erected the Flavian Amphitheatre. We know it as the Colosseum, a massive structure of stone and mortar, a gift to the people, yes, but also a declaration. Where a tyrant had built a private paradise, a people's emperor raised an arena for all, an architecture of power, designed so that the common citizen, sitting in the stands, could feel the greatness of Rome flowing through his veins as the blood of gladiators and beasts spilled onto the sand. Vespasian was succeeded by his son Titus, the conqueror of Jerusalem, a man whose brief light shone with an almost painful intensity. History remembers him as the delight of the human race, a generous soul in a soldier's body. But his reign was marked by fire and ash. In the year 79, Mount Vesuvius, which had been dozing like a tranquil beast over the Bay of Naples, awoke with geological fury. The sky darkened at midday. A rain of ash and pumice buried Pompeii and Herculaneum, freezing life in a moment of silent terror. Titus came, organized aid, emptied his own treasury to assist the survivors. The echo of iron and the ashes of civil wars had faded. The stone of the great Flavian amphitheatre, still young, rested under the sun of an empire that seemed to have reached its zenith. After the consolidation of the Flavians, Rome breathed a different air, an air of calm and maturity. It is in this fertile silence where the story of an era begins to be whispered. An era that later memory would call golden. The century that followed was not forged by the blood of a dynasty, but by the wisdom of an idea. It began with an elderly man, Nerva, a senator of ancient lineage and weary hands, who took the helm in the year 96. The Senate, weary of tyrants and generals proclaimed in distant camps, chose him as a bridge to stability. And in an act of clarity that would resonate for a century, Nerva did not look to his own blood, but to merit. He adopted as son and successor a Hispanic general, Marcus Ulpius Trajan. The golden chain had been forged. With Trajan, the eagles flew once more toward the horizon, but this time not with the feverish fury of youthful conquest, but with the calculated strength of a power at its peak. Dacia, with its gold mines, was subdued, its history forever etched in the column that still stands today as a stone scroll in the heart of Rome. The empire reached its greatest extent, its borders kissing the sands of Mesopotamia. But Trajan was not merely a conqueror. He was the best of princes. It is said that he shared the rations of his legionaries, that he knew the weight of the shield and the cold of steel at dawn. Under his command, markets, ports, and a system of assistance, the alimenta, for the orphaned children of Italy, were established. It was the hand of imperial power, not only wielding a sword, but also offering bread. His successor, Hadrian, was a man of a different nature. He did not yearn for more conquests, but for borders. He was a restless soul, an architect, a poet, a Greek at heart in a Roman body. He spent more than half of his reign traveling, traversing every province, feeling the pulse of his vast domain. He walked through the mist of Britannia, where the stone and sweat of his men raised a wall that separated the Roman world from mystery. He marveled at the pyramids of Egypt and rebuilt the Pantheon in Rome, crowning it with a dome that was a miniature cosmos. Hadrian did not. The golden light of the Antonines did not extinguish suddenly. It was a long twilight, a slow agony that slipped over the world like winter fog over the Tiber. The century that followed the death of Marcus Aurelius was not an explosion, but a collapse. The prolonged sound of an immense structure yielding under its own weight. That peace, the Pax Romana, which had seemed as eternal as the stone of its aqueducts, revealed itself to be fragile, a dream from which the empire awoke screaming. The very air seemed to have grown denser, laden with the scent of pine and fear in the forests of Germania, and with the dry dust of the Persian plains. The borders, once firm lines drawn with sword and law, became porous. The echo of iron against iron was no longer the sound of conquest, but that of a desperate defense. The legionary, grandson of those who had served under Trajan, no longer marched toward glory and plunder. He marched to seal one crack, and then another, in a dam that was cracking everywhere. He felt the cold of the metal of his armor, not as a symbol of power, but as a constant and icy embrace, the reminder of a death always near. In the heart of the empire, in Rome, the silence of the Senate was more eloquent than any speech. It was the silence of fear, lineage, wisdom. The ancient patrician authority no longer mattered. Power no longer resided on the hills of Rome, but in the military camps of the Danube and the Euphrates. The emperor was no longer the first citizen, chosen for his merit or his blood. He was a general, often of humble origin, a tough man forged on the frontier, elevated on shields by legions loyal only to their pay. They were the barracks emperors. Men like Maximinus the Thracian, a giant shepherd whose hand, it was said, was larger than the face of an ordinary man, and who never set foot in Rome during his reign. He ruled from his tent, with the sword as his scepter. For these men, the weight of the purple was a deferred death sentence. They ruled with paranoia as their advisor, knowing that the very legion that had hailed them could stab them in the back at dawn. In 50 years, more than 20 men claimed the title of Augustus, and almost all met their end at the edge of a dagger or a Roman sword. The empire, like a broken mirror, fragmented. In Gaul, the echo of the swords of the 3rd century had faded, but it left behind a feverish silence, the silence of an exhausted body after a long illness. The Pax Romana was a distant memory, a legend whispered by the old by the fire. The empire, that vast expanse of land and souls, lay wounded. Its borders were scars poorly healed, through which gold and life bled. Its provinces, fields exhausted by the plunder of ephemeral usurpers. The air smelled of ash and uncertainty. The imperial purple had become a shroud, passed from one general to another in a macabre dance that lasted 50 years and cost a world. In the midst of this twilight, from the dust of Dalmatia, a man emerged. He was not a patrician of ancient lineage, nor a philosopher educated in the academies of Athens. He was a soldier, Gaius Aurelius Valerius Diocletian, a man forged in the discipline of the legions and hardened by the relentless sun of the eastern frontier. His face, carved like the stone of his native mountains, did not promise a golden age, but order. He offered not freedom, but survival. When his soldiers acclaimed him Augustus in the year 284, he did not inherit a throne, but the remnants of a shipwreck. And like a resolute captain, he set out to caulk the cracked hull of the State S vessel, regardless of the cost. Diocletian looked at the map of the Roman world and saw what his predecessors, blinded by the glory of Rome, did not want to see. That the empire was too vast, its enemies too numerous, and its problems too deep for a single man. And so, in an act of pragmatism as brutal as it was necessary, he took the orb of the world, that symbol of indivisible unity, and split it. Not out of ambition, but out of desperation. He created the Tetrarchy, the government of four. He kept the East, the economic and strategic heart, and gave the West to a rough comrade in arms, Maximian. Both would hold the title of Augustus, and under them, two Caesars, Galerius and Constantius, designated heirs, would govern their own portions, learning the craft of power, waiting for their turn. It was a machine of government, precise, logical, designed to end the wars of succession, an engineer's solution to a problem of blood and soul. The old world faded away. Rome, the eternal city, became a venerable but distant symbol. The capitals were now on the frontier, where the emperor could feel the cold breath of the barbarian. Nicomedia, Mediolanum, Augusta Treverorum, Sirmium. The emperor was no longer the princeps, the first citizen who walked through the forum. He became the dominus, the lord and god, wrapped in purple silk and gold, separated from his. The calm that Diocletian had imposed upon the world was the calm of winter, a tense stillness beneath a leaden sky. His tetrarchy, that machinery of four heads designed to govern a fractured empire, was a work of political engineering, as precise and cold as the stone of his palaces. But stone, over time, cracks, and after the abdication of the old emperor, the cracks became chasms through which the icy wind of civil war blew. The system, conceived to prevent the ambition of a single man, was now drowning in it. And in that twilight of the Caesars, a figure rose forged on the frontier and polished in the court. Constantine. Son of a Caesar of the West, he had lived his youth as a luxury hostage in the heart of power, observing, learning the language of suspicion and the dagger. He knew the weariness of soldiers, the smell of sweat and leather from the legions loyal to him. He felt the weight of a lineage that demanded he reclaim what he considered his. But he also felt something more, an underground current running through the empire, a new faith that the fiercest persecutions of Diocletian had not managed to extinguish, but rather temper like steel in the forge. The decisive moment arrived at the gates of Rome, beside the slow and muddy waters of the Tiber. On one side of the Milvian bridge, Maxentius, with the city and its old gods on his side. On the other, Constantine and his army, outnumbered, uncertain. The night before the battle, the air was thick with omens. It is said that in the milky light of dawn, or in a fevered dream, Constantine saw a sign in the sky, not an eagle, not the unconquered sun that his father worshipped, but a strange symbol, a chairo, and with it, a promise whispered by the wind. In this sign, you will conquer. With this sign, you will conquer. We do not know what truly crossed the mind of the emperor. Was it a divine revelation? The cold calculation of a strategist who needed a new standard to unify his men? Or the confluence of both in the soul of a man cornered by history? The truth is that at dawn, the soldiers painted that unknown sign on their shields. The sound of iron clashing that day was not just that of a battle for power. It was the echo of a world breaking apart to give birth to another. Constantine's victory. after the tide that raised the cross above the banner of the eagle, the world was no longer the same. The echo of the old gods faded in the marble temples, now silent, and Emperor Constantine, a man shaped by war and touched by a new faith, felt the weight of centuries upon Rome. The Eternal City was a glorious mausoleum, an old woman dressed in purple whose heart beat with the slow rhythm of pagan memory. Its streets had drunk the blood of martyrs. Its hills held the lineage of Caesars who had believed themselves to be gods. For an empire that now looked towards a single god in heaven, Rome was an anchor in a past from which it longed to set sail. Power no longer resided in the decaying forums, nor in a senate that was barely the shadow of its former glory. The true pulse of the empire throbbed at the eastern borders, where the Persian threat was a perpetual winter, and along the Danube, a wound that was always open. Constantine, with the gaze of a world builder, understood that he needed a new center, not just an administrative capital, but a symbolic heart. A place that was not stained by the ghosts of the Republic, nor by the cult of its predecessors, a new Rome. It is said that he first thought of the plain of Troy, a poetic nod to the mythical origins of the Roman lineage. But his pragmatic and visionary gaze ultimately settled on the ancient Greek colony of Byzantium. It was a place blessed by geography, a triangular peninsula that jutted into the waters of the Bosporus, standing like a sentinel over the only passage between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, the bridge between Europe and Asia. It was a natural fortress, bathed by the sea on three sides, easy to defend and impossible to ignore. From its hills, an emperor could feel the breath of two continents. In the year 324, after his final victory over Licinius, he began the work. The legend, tinged with Christian piety, recounts that Constantine himself, spear in hand, traced the perimeter of the new walls. He walked and walked, marking an area so vast that his courtiers, perplexed, asked him when he would stop. It is said that he replied with the calm voice of one fulfilling a destiny, "I will stop when he who walks before me stops." The construction was a feverish, almost desperate endeavor. Thousands of hands moved in unison, lifting stone upon stone. The sound of hammer and chisel drowned out the murmur of the waves. To give his city instant splendor, the new Rome, Constantinople, already breathed with its own lungs of marble and gold by the Bosporus. Its foundation was not a mere act of imperial vanity, but the acknowledgement of a truth that had become as heavy as stone. The center of gravity of the world had shifted eastward. The empire was an aging colossus whose heart beat more strongly in its eastern side, richer, more populated, and more defensible. The west, with its long borders exposed to the mists of Germania and the steppes of the Danube, increasingly felt like a distant limb, often cold and aching. The idea of governing the vast body of Rome with two heads was not new. Diocletian had already woven that complex web of Augusti and Caesaris, a desperate attempt to manage the unmanageable. But human ambitions, like tides, always erode the most ingenious structures. Constantine had reunited the world under a single crown, but the echo of division persisted, like a crack in an ancient vase that, once mended, never fully regains its strength. It was Theodosius, a Spaniard of iron will and orthodox Christian faith, the last man who heard the heartbeat of a unified Roman Empire under his command. He fought against usurpers, pacified the Goths through treaties that would set a dangerous precedent, and for a brief moment, The imperial purple was once again won. But it was a fragile unity, sustained by the strength of a single man. Perhaps, in the silence of his chamber in Mediolanum, while the winter of 395 covered the plains with frost, he understood that a single pair of shoulders could no longer bear the weight of the world. His testament was not the act of a visionary, but that of a weary pragmatist. Upon his death, he bequeathed not an empire, but two halves of the same heart to his children. To Arcadius, the eldest, he entrusted the East, with its brilliant capital, bustling trade routes, and complex diplomacy. To Honorius, barely a child, fell the West, with the symbolic burden of old Rome, its depopulated fields, and the incessant pressure on its borders. It was not conceived as a divorce, but as a shared inheritance. Two brothers who would govern two courts, but one Roman people. Or so it was hoped. But distance and time have their own relentless logic. What began as an administrative part, the tide of peoples that struck the borders in the previous century had not receded. It had simply flooded the land. The great oak of the West was no longer supported by its own strength, but by the very barbarian vines that had climbed its trunk, slowly suffocating it. By the middle of the 5th century, being emperor of the West was not about ruling, but presiding over a dissolution. Real power did not reside in the palaces of a Rome already plundered and ghostly, nor even in the walled court of Ravenna, that fortress surrounded by marshes. Real power wore leather and iron, and spoke Latin with the rough accent of the Danube or the Rhine. It was the masters of the soldiers, the Germanic warlords, who appointed and deposed emperors as if they were pieces on a worn-out board. In this setting of dying lights, men forged in ambiguity emerged. One of them was Orestes, a Roman patrician, who had served as secretary to Attila the Hun. He knew both worlds, the decadent silk of the court and the brutal honesty of the steppe. Filled with an ambition that no longer corresponded to the reality of the empire, he decided that the purple throne should belong to his lineage. In the year 475, he marched on Ravenna and forced Emperor Julius Nepos to flee. He did not crown himself. In an act of paternal pride, he placed the diadem on the head of his own son, a boy of barely 10 years. History, at times, allows for cruel ironies. The boy was named Romulus, and for his youth, posterity would add the diminutive Augustulus, the little Augustus, the founder of Rome and the founder of the empire, united in the name of the last boy to sit on its throne. But Orestes' power depended on his army, an amalgamation of Heruli, Sciri, and other federated tribes, camped in Italy. These soldiers, weary of distant wars and broken promises, felt the cold in their bones and the hunger in their bellies. They had defended an idea of Rome that barely existed anymore, and now they wanted their pay, not in devalued coins, but in the only currency that matters when everything collapses: land. Their leader, a Syrian chief named Odoacer, tall and imposing, brought their demands before Orestes. They asked for 1/3 of the lands of Italy to settle. The request was not a war cry, but the severe murmur of a debt that had come due. Orestes, trapped in a Roman pride that no longer had legions to bear, as the ashes of Rome cooled in the west and silence took hold of the moss-covered forums, a stubborn light refused to extinguish in the east. It was not the glow of a fire, but the constant flame of an oil lamp, shielded from the winds of time. The empire had not died. It had simply shed its soul. On the shores of the Bosporus, Constantinople breathed, a heart still beating with the pulse of Rome. It was a city that was not an end, but a continuation, an echo that had decided to have its own voice. The marble of its forum still remembered the Latin of the Caesars, but the streets already whispered in Greek. The salty scent of the golden horn mingled with the incense rising from 100 new churches. Here, the lineage of Augustus was no longer measured by blood, but by the guardianship of an idea. They called themselves Romans, Romaioi, and felt it with a conviction that the fragmented West could no longer comprehend. For them, Rome was not a geography of ruins, but a state of spirit, a sacred duty. In the 6th century, one man embodied this obsession: Justinian. He was not a patrician of ancient lineage, but a peasant from Illyria, with iron will and tireless gaze, a man said to barely sleep. In his nights of vigil, he did not see ghosts, but maps. He saw Italy, Africa, Hispania, not as lost kingdoms, but as amputated members of a body that still felt pain for their absence. His dream, the Renovatio Imperii, the renewal of the empire, was more than a political ambition. It was a fever, an almost religious need to restore the order of the world. For this impossible task, he found an executor in Belisarius, a general whose tactical genius seemed a gift from the ancient gods. His legions, who now prayed to Christ but marched with the discipline of Scipio, crossed the sea. The African sun shone again over the banners of the eagle as they dismantled the Vandal kingdom with astonishing speed. Then came Italy. The Gothic War was a long and bitter wound, a struggle for the soul of the peninsula, where each city was a siege, and each victory left a trail of scars on the land. The soldiers, weary under the weight of their armor and history, looked at the broken statues of the emperors and wondered if they fought for a future or for a glorious past. But the true character of this new empire was for the roar of iron and the cry of the legions have faded in the west, replaced by the silence of the fields and the wind whistling through the ruins. In the east, the imperial eagle still flies, but its shadow lengthens and changes shape, becoming something new, something Byzantine. And in the midst of this twilight, when one world dies and another struggles to be born, we pause to listen. For even in death, Rome does not fall silent. Its voice has transformed into an echo, one that resonates not on the battlefield, but in the very soul of the coming centuries. Observe the stone, the cold stone of the aqueducts that still traverse the valleys of Gaul or Hispania, like skeletons of a time of giants. The peoples who now inhabit those lands, the Visigoths, the Franks, look upon them with a mixture of fear and reverence. They do not understand the engineering, the precise mathematics that allowed water to flow for 100 miles to quench the thirst of a city. To them, these are works of gods or demons, vestiges of a power that escapes their understanding. The Colosseum rises in the heart of a plundered Rome, its arches empty like the eye sockets of a skull. No longer do gladiators resonate, but the murmur of pilgrims who see in its grandeur the proof of a pride punished. And yet, the form of that arch, the solidity of that dome, will become the seed of the cathedrals that one day will rise towards the sky, an architectural lineage that Rome bequeathed to the faith that conquered it. Art also tells this story of ghosts. In the abandoned villas, beneath layers of earth and forgetfulness, sleep the mosaics that once felt the feet of patricians and matrons. A face of marble, split in half and covered in moss, lies in an unkempt garden. Its eyes, carved with a mastery that sought to capture not only the form, but the spirit, no longer gaze upon an emperor in his triumph. They look upon the slow growth of grass, the passage of the seasons. For centuries, that lost perfection will be a dream, an unattainable ideal that the artists of the Renaissance will unearth, as if awakening a sleeping ancestor, to learn once more to sculpt humanity in stone. But the deepest legacy of Rome cannot be touched by fingers nor seen by eyes. It is an idea, a persistent. We have walked among the ruins of their culture and felt the weight of their law, echoes that time has not managed to silence completely. But beneath the stone of the aqueducts and the marble of the forums, there flowed a silent current, an invisible stream that was the blood and nerve of the empire. Today, we pause to listen to its pulse, the economy of Rome. It was not an economy of abstract figures or stock markets, but something much more tangible, more earthly. It was the scent of cedar wood from Lebanon in the docks of Ostia. It was the cold shine of silver extracted with the sweat of slaves in the mines of Hispania. It was the weight of grain from Egypt, the golden tide that fed the insatiable hunger of the capital. The Mediterranean, its mare nostrum, had become a lake without borders, traversed not only by war triremes, but also by heavy cargo ships that wove an incessant web of dependence and prosperity. The roads, those stone veins that stretched to the edges of the mist in Britannia and the sands of Syria, transported not only legions, but also oil, wine, pottery, and dreams of fortune. At the heart of this system beat the land. The small farmer, heir to an ancient dialogue with the sun and the soil, remained the pillar upon which everything rested. His back, bent under the heat of Tuscany or Gaul, produced the surplus that freed other men to be soldiers, engineers, or poets. But alongside him, the latifundia grew like shadows, immense properties of absent senators, worked by armies of slaves. There, the land was no longer a mother, but a resource. And in that distinction, in that growing gap between man and his sustenance, a seed of future desolation was sown. And then there were the actors of the movement, the merchant, the shipowner, men who lived by risk, who wagered their lives and fortunes against storms and pirates. In the ports of Ephesus or Carthage, the murmur of 100 tongues mingled with the creaking of wooden cranes, lifting amphorae that contained the flavour of a distant province. The silver denarius, with the profile of the Caesar engraved on its surface, was more than a coin. It was a promise, a symbol of order that could be accepted by a legionary on the banks of the Rhine and by a silk merchant in Antioch. It unified space, turning the note as the memory of the empire fades into the mist of time and the echo of the legions dies away in the distant valleys. Something remains. Something more enduring than the lineage of the Caesars and more solid than the pacts written on papyrus. It is a whisper in the stone, a logic inscribed in the landscape. It is the silent legacy of Roman science and technology, the invisible scaffolding that supported a world. The Roman genius did not dwell in the clouds of pure theory, as the Greek did, but in the dust and sweat of the tangible world. They did not seek the essence of the cosmos, but the means to master it. Their science was a tool, not a philosophy. Their laboratory was the battlefield, the quarry, the expanding city. The quintessential Roman thinker was not a solitary astronomer, but an engineer like Vitruvius, a man who understood that the beauty of a column must serve the solidity of a roof, and that both must serve the lives of men. Observe the great works. The roads, those stone veins that pumped armies, goods and ideas from misty Britannia to the sands of Syria. They were not mere paths. They were feats of surveying and construction, with their deep foundations, their layers of gravel, and their perfectly fitted slabs, designed to withstand the passage of 1,000 winters. A legionary, with the cold of iron penetrating his bones at dawn, could feel beneath his sandals the certainty of a civilization, the promise that the road home, however long, was traced with the same reason that had built the Forum. And the water, which is the blood of a city. The aqueducts were not just bridges for aerial rivers, they were the victory over thirst and disease. From the distant hills, through tunnels excavated with millimeter precision and arches that defied gravity, clean water flowed to the fountains, the baths, and the sewers of Rome. A man like Sextus Julius Frontinus, the curator of the waters, did not count gallons, but managed life itself. In his writings, there is no poetry, but the weight of responsibility, the exact calculation of a flow that meant the difference between health and plague for 1,000,000 souls. All this was made possible by a secret that the Romans perfected, the opus cementitium, concrete. A mixture of lime, volcanic sand and rubble that not only hardened over time, but could set under water. It was a heart of liquid stone that, upon drying, and so, the fire burns out, and the last embers flicker in the darkness. We have traveled together through the centuries, from the murmur of a stream beside 7 hills to the roar of an empire that encompassed the known world. Now, in the silence that follows the end of history, we are left with the heaviest question, the one that travels with the wind over the ruins. What remains of Rome? Do not seek its ghost solely in the broken marble of the Forum, nor in the perfect and solitary curve of an aqueduct silhouetted against the sky of Provence, covered in moss and thyme. Rome did not die, it transformed into landscape, into memory, into the very earth we tread. Its legacy is not a relic kept under glass, but the air we breathe. It is a persistent echo, sometimes a whisper, sometimes a distant thunder. Consider the idea of law. Before Rome, justice was often the will of a king, the whim of a local god, or the law of the strongest. The Romans, with their relentless pragmatism, bequeathed us something more. They gave us the grammar of justice, the notion that a citizen, whether in misty Britain or sunny Syria, was protected by the same set of principles. The civil law, the idea that power must have limits, that there exists a public sphere, the republic that belongs to all of us. That concept, forged in the crucible of their civil wars and perfected in the peace of their finest days, is the cornerstone upon which our modern republics are built. When a court deliberates in silence, it is listening to the echo of the Roman praetors. And with the law, the word. Latin, the language of soldiers and poets, does not lie in a tomb. It became a mother river that divided into 1,000 tributaries. Listen carefully to Spanish, French, Italian, Portuguese, Romanian. In the cadence of our phrases, in the roots of our words to name love, war, faith, and the city, lives the voice of Cicero and Virgil. Latin did not die. It learned to speak new dialects, to tell new stories. It lives in our mouths every time we speak. Of course, its heritage is also a shadow. The dream of a universal order, the Roman peace, was built on the tip of the sword. We must remember the weary legionary, feeling the cold of the